Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2018 John Menadue Oration for the Centre for Policy Development, which will be delivered by Professor Mariana Mazzucato. My name is Trav McLeod. I'm very fortunate to lead the Centre for Policy Development, and I'm super excited about tonight, and I hope you are too. You are in for a treat. Not only Mariana as the headline act, but also Laura Tingle, Glyn Davis, and Sam Mostyn, and of course, the night couldn't have started better with that wonderful installation out in the foyer from Nick Cave. So thank you all for coming here. You're very welcome. To get things underway, it's my privilege to introduce Yvonne Weldon, the current elected chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, to perform the traditional Welcome to Country. Please make Yvonne welcome.
Certainly a bit of dramatics walking across there, isn't it? No real performance here, just little old me. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers. As was said, my name is Yvonne Weldon. I'm a Wiradjuri woman from Canberra, here in New South Wales. I'm from the waters of the Clare, also known as the Lachlan, and of the Murrumbidgee Rivers. I'm the elected chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the cultural authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land we're meeting on. I would like to pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and to all First Nations and non-First Nations people here this evening. We're meeting here in the lands of the Eora Nation. The boundaries of the traditional owners are not defined by the hand or by the pen, but through the natural landscapes of the earth. The Eora Nation's country covers the Hawkes River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders, and the members, I welcome everyone to the land of the Gadigal and acknowledge the Gadigal people whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with this land, our Mother Earth. My people have practiced our traditions for thousands of years and endless generations. One tradition they shared in various forms across Australia is a welcome to country. It is more than just words, it is a spiritual process by honouring the ancestors' footsteps we are all walking in, continuing the practice of many generations before us to the many generations to come, where we have shared and traded our resources, our knowledge and our traditions has been my people's way of life since time began. Traded and shared amongst the nations, the tribes and the clans which have existed here for over 60,000 years, where we traded for necessity and not for empires. Our songlines and our customs have sustained us, and they are embedded into the core of this nation. We are the world's oldest living culture. As we all gathered here, let us all remember and acknowledge the many warriors that created pathways for us all, the ones recognised and the ones you've never heard of. There have been many lessons learned at our expense and our devastation. They should and must be acknowledged, not out of a guilt, but to listen, learn and to come together, to commence a healing and creating a future for all. So don't live regretting what we should have done, but create the legacy of what must be done. As you connect, learn and share, today, tomorrow and beyond. Don't lose sight of the important work that still needs to be done to bring my people, your people and our people together. If we are to move forward, we need to do so in partnerships equally. All of us can make a positive change to this country now and into the future. To make that future possible, let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, welcome to Gadigal land. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Well, thank you, Yvonne, for that wonderful welcome to Gadigal land. We're on special Aboriginal land, auspicious land here at Carriageworks. We're in Redfern, where, as many of you will know, Paul Keating gave that famous speech in 1992 about the recognition of injustice done to Indigenous Australians. This is a place of protest, of activism, of work, of migration, of a desire for a more equal and just Australian society. That speech was 26 years ago yesterday, and in that time we've had 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth. And if there's a sort of a contradiction that kind of fleshes out, one of the themes of Mariana's talk tonight, that growth isn't enough, it's about the direction of that growth, that might be one of them. Carriageworks is a perfect venue for tonight, not just because of its history as the old rail yards and the hub of the Great Strike of 1917, when Ben Chifley and others walked off the job, but also because it's a brilliant story of renewal, led by public investment, as well as business, community and cultural support. We're fortunate to have Sam Mostyn here, who's a tremendous CPD board member and also the chairperson of Carriageworks. Sam, we agree on many things except for our football allegiances. I'm a West Coast Eagles fan. Sam, as you know, is on the board of the Sydney Swans. She will give the vote of thanks later on tonight. Tonight is the Centre for Policy Development's flagship event of the year. It's named after our founding chairperson, John Menadue AO. John had a phenomenal career, and it's still continuing. He worked closely with two Prime Ministers, Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser, was Ambassador to Japan, Secretary of the Department of Immigration and of Trade. He was CEO of Qantas. He worked across the political aisle and worked to build that symbiotic relationship between politics, government, business and the community. When I met John, he told me he'll never retire, which is why he still runs a sensational blog, which I should plug, called Pearls and Irritations, with his wife Susie. John insists that he is the irritation, Susie is the pearl. You are all distinguished guests tonight, and we're thrilled that you're here, but it is special to have John and Susie in the audience, together with Miriam Lyons, CPD's founding executive director, other board members of CPD, all our staff, former staff, interns and supporters. We have all of our former chairs in the room, and our current chair, Terry Moran, AC. I want to acknowledge them and thank them for everything they do, and particularly tonight, Terry's predecessor, Martin Stewart Weeks, who helped to secure this year's orator. This is the second Menadue Oration. We had the inaugural oration last year to celebrate CPD's 10th anniversary series. And Marty Natalegawa, the much-loved former Indonesian Foreign Minister, asked whether democracy could deliver. He said it could and it must. This year's oration is a bit closer to Christmas, but if the crowd here tonight is any guide, stretched right up into the bleachers, it's certainly been worth waiting for. In a moment, I'll introduce Mariana Mazzucato, who is visiting Australia for the first time this week, arrived on Sunday. And if you still don't have a Christmas present for your loved ones, whether they've been naughty or nice, there are some brilliant copies of her books that she signed earlier that are being sold this evening. Please do get a copy. For those of you who haven't heard much about the Centre for Policy Development, you're probably wondering what we've been doing this past decade, given that policy development in Australia has often looked more like a Rubik's Cube than a well-oiled machine. But I can assure you that our team has been working on some of the toughest policy challenges facing this country and our region. Let me give you three examples of our recent work. We've spent much of the two past months embedded in the city of Wyndham, one of the fastest growing areas in Victoria, helping them to develop a place-based approach to help vulnerable new arrivals to find safe, secure jobs and start businesses faster. We spent 10 days in Bangladesh in October, including several in the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, conducting a human trafficking and exploitation risk assessment, working very closely with partners in 3 countries and a number of UN agencies. And we've been working hard and quietly to convince businesses and regulators to take a more proactive approach to climate risk and sustainable finance. Work you may have seen mentioned in some speeches by Australia's financial regulators. In all that we do, CPD seeks to create, to connect and to convince on the great challenges and opportunities facing Australia and our region. Organisations like CPD don't exist and don't last without some fantastic supporters. And many of our supporters, organisations, individuals, institutional and otherwise, are here tonight, and I want to thank you all for supporting our work, for helping to bring independent policy research in the public interest to amplify that for Australian decision makers. I'd particularly like to thank Qantas for helping to bring Mariana out to Australia and for their support in doing so, and to Carriageworks for being such a wonderful partner tonight. Renewing Australia's democracy and rebuilding confidence in our public institutions is at the core of CPD's DNA. When John and Miriam started CPD, they wanted to inject evidence into policy making on the biggest policy challenges facing the country. But there was a higher ambition, which was to rewire Australia's democracy and economy for the long term, to think about the frameworks for the relationships between governments, markets, society and the environment, the future of the public service and of public services, options for democratic innovations and citizens' involvement in policy making. And it's precisely those objectives that make this year's headline act, Mariana Mazzucato and her work, so special for CPD and very much in sync with what we're about. Over the past 2 years, CPD has been doing attitudes research on what Australians want from their democracy and from their government. And that research, we think, has generated a big silver lining, despite the distrust that's permeating through societies and democracies around the world, including this one. When we asked Australians what they thought the main purpose of democracy is, most Australians say it's about ensuring that all people are treated fairly and equally, including the most vulnerable in the community. That answer is twice as popular as the next most common answers, which are about liberty, being free to decide how you live your life, and process, about electing representatives. We think that's a significant result, as is some of the other results about what Australians want from their democracy, from their government, that reveal that we're somewhat unique in how we think about a democratic society. Our democratic bargain is purposeful. It's about ends, not means. It's bold. Government is desired as an active and an effective partner. And it's egalitarian. People want all Australians to live fair and flourishing lives. So what is Australia's bold mission or missions? What's our Vision Splendid, our moonshot initiative? And what's the role of the state in getting us there? It's that question that will be at the heart of Professor Mazzucato's oration tonight. After her oration, she'll be joined on stage by the ABC 7:30 Report's Laura Tingle and Glyn Davis, AC, to continue the conversation. You'll be familiar with both those names and may have already seen Laura's interview with Mariana on the 7:30 Report last night. Laura, as you'll know, is an Walkley Award-winning journalist. She's one of Australia's most respected commentators and has herself written 3 brilliant quarterly essays. They are also available tonight, and what a Christmas combination that would be. Mazzucato and Tingle on expectations of the state, leadership and public value. Professor Glyn Davis is one of Australia's most formidable educators and is one of the sharpest policy minds in the country. He recently finished up as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne after nearly 14 years in that job. Before then, he was Vice-Chancellor of Griffith. He's probably shaken many of the hands of people in the room tonight if you graduated from those universities. He's now a distinguished professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. He co-chaired the 2020 Summit back in 2008 and also ran the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Queensland, among a number of other very important roles. Significantly for tonight, Glyn is on the panel, chaired by David Thodey, doing an independent review of the Australian public service, the future of the APS, and that panel will report after the next federal election. So thank you, Glyn and Laura, for being part of tonight. We're looking forward to the conversation, which will be moderated by Laura after the speech. So now to our orator, Professor Mariana Mazzucato. As you know, she's a leading thinker on how to build smart, sustainable and inclusive growth. Her books, The Entrepreneurial State, Rethinking Capitalism, which she co-edited with Michael Jacobs, and The Value of Everything, which came out this year, have been extremely influential. Central to Mariana's ideas is a more ambitious and decisive role for public policy in shaping the rate and direction of growth, working in tandem with the private sector and the community on some of the biggest challenges that are transforming our societies. Mariana is now Professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London and the founder and director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She's been described as one of the scariest economists in the world, and last night by 7:30 as an economic rock star. And I happen to know she does like the B-52s. Her work has been picked up directly by governments and institutions all over the world of all political persuasions. She's at the heart of thinking about the UK's industrial strategy. She's at the heart of ideas being pushed in the United States about a Green New Deal, mission-driven innovation in the European Union, the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and huge initiatives in Scotland, Finland, just to name several examples. She's won numerous prizes from different parts of the world, and just on the weekend, she was named by Bloomberg in their top 50 list for the year as one to watch. Well, she has already been one to watch, and a lot of people are listening and liking her ideas and wanting to pick them up. It's significant that the only Australian named on that list, the Bloomberg 50, was Kenneth Hayne, the Royal Commissioner for the Banking Royal Commission. Just think about that. Quite uniquely, Mariana's work speaks not just to the future of government, but also of business and finance and how those worlds work together. Mariana arrived in Sydney on Sunday morning. By 1 p.m, she had done the Bondi to Coogee walk and had 2 swims. She supports Arsenal. She's a dual US-Italian citizen, lives in Camden in London, and is very much a storyteller, not just an economist. It's an absolute delight to have her in Australia this week, and I think you'll have fun listening to her oration. Would you please make her very welcome to deliver the oration, Can the State Deliver?
Far away. Can't you come closer? No, or I might come close to you. So thank you so much. Thank you to Yvonne for that amazing welcome to the country, and Trevor's and the whole staff of CPD who've choreographed an amazing week for me, very busy but very inspiring. And to John and Susie, I haven't met you yet, but I hope that we will meet very soon right after the talk and we can exchange ideas about this great topic. Is it up there? Yes, it is. Good. And, you know, it's interesting, the pressure, actually, we put on states. You know, can the state deliver? When, actually, there's so many problems across different actors in society. Just think of the financial crisis and what that exposed, of the difficulties across both finance and business. And so I think that perhaps the reason that sometimes I look scary is because, actually, I don't think I look scary at all there. Bill Gates looks a bit scarier than me. I'm not sure. But anyway, is precisely this, provocation to make sure that we're putting equal pressure on the different partners, right, in society, so including civil society, you know, trade unions, different types of businesses, their governance structures, the financial sector, is it actually doing its job? And of course, the state. And one of the interesting things is that because we've actually often dismissed the state in terms of its ability to create value, the words we use that I'll talk about in a minute are often quite boring. You know, the state is just about enabling and facilitating and fixing things. Then perhaps we also haven't structured our state institutions, which are really kind of a decentralized network of different institutions, including our public broadcasters like ABC. And I had a very good time yesterday with Laura Tingle, but we were both a bit peed off that cricket somehow got in the way of our long, deep discussion. Anyway, we'll talk about that later, perhaps. But, you know, actually things are quite scary in terms of, and I don't like the word scary because many of these things that are worrying, like climate change, could actually be seen as an opportunity. But, you know, it is quite scary. So if you've read the IPCC report of the international group on climate change, apparently we just have 12 years left in terms of when things are going to get extremely bad. I mean, we've already seen across the world, and Australia, of course, is very concerned about this because of the geography of the country. But, you know, instead of thinking of it as, you know, in terms of being scary, what could this actually present to us in terms of new investment opportunities, seeing these problems, and just think of all the sustainable development goals, 17 of them. There's 17 goals that over 100 countries have signed up to. Underneath them, there's about 169 targets. How are we actually going to get there? And of course, we will only get there in terms of solving these problems in partnership. So different types of public actors, different types of businesses, the financial sector, again, properly doing its job, but also social movements, which have always historically been critical to the shaping of markets under capitalism. We should never forget what trade unions brought us in terms of making sure that markets have been more inclusive and sustainable in the real sense of the word. So, you know, even just having weekends and 8-hour workdays and construction workers who have construction hats, that was actually fought for by people. So what, you know, how can we together actually tackle these difficult problems? So that's what I want to talk about tonight. I'll get to the issue of the state, but first just to kind of remember that it's not just the state that has to deliver, but these other actors as well. One of the big problems that, of course, the financial crisis revealed is just how dysfunctional in some ways the financial sector had become, or has become. We shouldn't forget that at one time, you know, the financial sector even had words like chemical bank. So there was banks that were actually directly fueling growth within the real economy. So in that case, it was the chemical industry, which isn't necessarily a good thing or bad thing, kind of depends what was happening in the chemical industry. But there was a much more direct relationship between how finance saw its role and what we call the real economy. Just think of how industries are operating, and then how work is being structured, and how technological change occurs in those industries. And the two things have gotten quite divorced. And this graph here, which is by Andy Haldane, who's the chief economist in the Bank of England, just shows just how much, this is data for the UK, but in the US it was even worse, just how much finance kind of just ended up getting a logic of its own. This shows the growth of financial intermediation. That's that top dotted line compared to the rest of the economy. So in terms of gross value added in the economy, think of everything else that happens besides finance. I think agriculture is also not included there. And that's basically because finance has basically been financing finance. So other parts of the financial sector. We sometimes call that FIRE, finance, insurance, and real estate. And that's one side of what we call the financialization problem. Another side of the financialization problem is just how much industry itself, which maybe hasn't had, again, this direct relationship with finance, but industry itself has become financialized. So these pressures around maximizing shareholder value has actually made lots of industries kind of forget, again, what the whole point is of running a company, and increasingly use their income, so profits, not to be reinvested back into production in terms of, you know, investing in human capital, so workers, training programs, machinery, and the different things that happen at work, but just in doing things like buying back their own shares. So buying back your shares, which increases stock prices, stock options, and surprise, surprise, executive pay. And this, by the way, is getting even worse over time. So Apple, under Steve Jobs, basically most of the profits were reinvested back in the company, especially around the whole issue of design. That's one of the big things that Apple has been very good at, more than R&D. I'll get to that later. And recently under Tim Cook, you know, massive share buyback schemes of the amount of close to 100 billion. And this, by the way, is probably one of the biggest problems in terms of work. There's all this talk about the robots are coming, the robots are going to take, you know, jobs away, and wages are going to fall because of that. And it's quite interesting that when you go back in the history of economic thought, you find that lots of thinkers actually were already talking about that 200 years ago. So David Ricardo, who's one of the first economists, kind of proper economists, who actually wrote a textbook called Principles of Political Economy, he had a chapter called On Machinery. It was chapter 31. He wrote that book in 1821. It's incredible how I remember these things. I forget everyone's names and all the kind of things I did yesterday, but you know, chapter 31, 1821. Wow. Anyway, and he was worried about exactly that. that, this mechanization that he was witnessing during the Industrial Revolution was in fact taking jobs. And what we saw then for about 200 years was that in fact there was this kind of natural thing that was happening, that often mechanization did in fact displace labor. So that's not new. Why are we talking about this so much today? What is new is this stuff. So when profits stop getting reinvested back in the economy, of course that's bad for jobs. Because what used to happen was that even though machine A would be introduced and perhaps take jobs, as long as the profits were then reinvested in another part of the economy, those jobs lost actually then appeared elsewhere. As well as workers being invested in, if profits were also being reinvested in human capital, their ability also to adapt to big changes was greater. And it's quite interesting how this kind of is ignored in this whole debate about what's going to happen to jobs under work. Anyway, so this is a huge problem. And in fact, you also see this at the macroeconomic level. You see it in terms of this lack of reinvestment, in terms of the falling levels of investment, which you can see both in terms of fixed capital investment. You also see it in terms of R&D expenditures, so especially the ratio of these share buybacks over R&D, which is a good proxy of the investments that companies are making and actually improving long-run growth. That's getting worse. So this is the context, really, I think, of tonight's discussion of can the state deliver? Because the quick answer is, of course not. Because how can the state or any of these actors not deliver together, again, to tackle these really big global challenges that also have national ramifications, whether they be challenges around inequality, challenges around climate change, challenges around, in some countries, this whole issue around the aging and demographic crisis, the future of the welfare state and healthcare, et cetera. So of course the state can't deliver if finance isn't doing its job and the business isn't doing its job. And then is the state then also doing its job, right? So I want to focus more on that for the rest of this talk. And they've given me 40 whole minutes, so hopefully you'll stay awake. I'll have to crack some jokes every now and then. So the state's problem, I believe, and we discussed this also last night at a lecture I gave at UTS where I kind of unpicked this whole graph here, which we'll spend less time on tonight, is that the way we framed the role of the public sector today, and literally also how we then train civil servants, is in terms of fixing problems when they happen. And one of the biggest problems I've already just kind of mentioned in passing, the financial crisis. That had to be fixed, so all these banks were bailed out. Many industries were also bailed out. In the US, the whole auto industry was basically bailed out, and that was a big bandage that had to be brought in. But also in general, basically policymakers around the world, and I've had really interesting discussions with your own policymakers over the last 2 days, and they confirmed that they're basically not allowed to do anything until they actually identify the kind of screw up that happens in the market. So what's the market failure that you're going to fix? And it's not that these different failures don't exist. So, when you have public goods like basic research that the private sector doesn't invest in because the spillovers are so great, so they can't make a profit from it. That's why the state has to come in and do basic research. That is a market failure. Or when companies pollute too much because their cost structures don't actually embody the bad stuff that pollution does, so they need a carbon tax to make them embody that into their costs. Or when you have asymmetric information, et cetera, et cetera. This is actually in some ways a powerful framework. It's useful, but it'd be very hard to use it to actually understand some of the biggest changes that have occurred in the role of the state within that change. And in the book, The Entrepreneurial State, I kind of went through the big technological changes that have occurred from the internet to aeronautics to mass production and today the clean technology sector. And I kind of go through why actually the state did much, much more than just fixing different types of market failures. And it's quite striking how then this language of fixing and mending and enabling and facilitating and de-risking, I always kind of start getting bored as I say it, is so powerful. I even find myself sometimes using it. We forget just how kind of lame and boring it is. Even, central banks, which again kind of saved the capitalist system from completely falling apart after the financial crisis. Forget whether they did it right or wrong, but it happened. They're seen as lenders of last resort, right? Again, kind of lame. When you see these big investments that have occurred over time by different types of state structures, they were investors of first resort. But these words have become so powerful in sort of common parlance that they become part of the storytelling, part of the discourse, and then makes it really hard, actually, to allow the state to deliver in ambitious ways and also be a dynamic partner alongside these other actors. And of course, there's the great magazine, The Economist, that never fails to have their great editorial pieces which make it just really clear how powerful this frame is, which is, the state, yeah, of course it's important, we're smarter than the Tea Party, but just kind of do your basic stuff. Invest in skills and infrastructure and roads and bridges, but then get the hell out of the way and let the revolutionaries do their thing, the value creators, the wealth creators. And this is so powerful that even the Labour Party in the UK, I found, started talking that way. When they lost the 2015 election, there was all this kind of thought, well, how did we lose? And there was 3 different articles I remember. Tony Blair, I think it was Rachel Reeves and Chukwamuna, all in different ways kind of said the same thing. We lost because we didn't embrace the wealth creators. And I thought, a Labour Party using this word wealth creator in such a narrow way, because they were basically talking about business. And of course, business creates wealth, but so does labor. You're called the Labour Party. Workers create wealth. Different types of public institutions create wealth. But how can they create it? How can we actually structure these different organizations in such a way that they can really also challenge each other, which is just as important as addressing the challenges. Contested spaces are very important for creating value. Anyway, so I made this graph for my TED Talk so many years ago that it took such a long time to make it that I have to put it up there to justify the effort. It was actually quite funny that the proper, so this is real TED, not just TEDx. And they were so nervous that you kind of screw up your TED Talk that there was like, are you ready? Have you made your slides? Would you like the Prezi team in San Francisco to make the slides for you? And I was like, all right, yeah, that kind of sounds cool. So the Prezi team in San Francisco basically made this funky Prezi thing for me, being guided, micromanaged, and this was one of the slides. Anyway, so this is supposed to show what basically we've been trained to think, that all the really interesting, value creation is done in business by people like Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, and every country has their versions of that. And then you have these bureaucrats, right? This is a Kafkian bureaucrat. And as I said last night, forget that Kafka is much cuter and handsome than Zuckerberg. You're supposed to think that the guys there on the left, or your left, yeah, my left too, are more sexy and interesting. So that, it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that the more we pretend that the state is about facilitating, de-risking, enabling, doing the horizontal conditions, shoving some papers here and there, getting the tax system right, setting the rules of the game, leveling, that's kind of what we end up getting. We end up getting this kind of black and white and sometimes a bit boring and inertial and bureaucratic structures that then we like to complain about and say that they're slow and bureaucratic. But it's like, yeah, well, that's what we basically told them that they were like. And so we just then have to pause a minute and say, how did we get there? Like, why do we have this self-fulfilling prophecy? And how can we get out of that precisely so the state can deliver and become a dynamic partner, also a thorn in the side of the other partners, which is one of the roles. Healthy marriages or partnerships are where you also challenge each other. You don't just say, what do you need? Let's be business friendly. Business, what would you like? Less tax, less regulation, okay. So how can we get healthy and symbiotic and mutualistic partnerships? I'm often reminded by my biologist friends, which are basically just 2. I have, unfortunately, lots of lawyer friends, but the biologists are very interesting. And they often say, why do you always use this word ecosystem? Do you even know what you're talking about? I'm like, no, not really. They say, do you mean predator-prey? Do you mean parasitic? Do you mean mutualistic? Do you mean symbiotic? Which ecosystem? And it's such a good point, because we often, especially in the policy arena, we hear this word partnership and ecosystems, entrepreneurial ecosystems, innovation ecosystems, and then forget to define them. Are we sure we haven't actually built a predator-prey ecosystem, a parasitic ecosystem? And how can we change that? Even in terms of the contracts that, in fact, often structure these partnerships, how public and private interact. Just a quick example, Novartis, a big pharmaceutical company, today is working for free on the International Space Station. And patenting. Who thought about that? Where's the contract? How can that be that there's no sort of payback into this big publicly funded infrastructure, which does cost a lot of money for such a highly profitable company, which is using not just the infrastructure, but the time of the astronauts up there to do some of their research. And there's a very interesting story about that, how that happened, which I don't have time for. Anyway, so I often say, let's just pause a minute and just remind ourselves that, in fact, markets, the word market, which we often hear as well, is actually an outcome right? Markets and business are not the same thing. The market is an outcome of the interactions between public and private and third sector, so civil society organizations, and how those organizations are governed. So I just mentioned the shareholder maximization governance, but also how the public sector is governed, if it's just about fixing market failures or other things. And how these interactions are structured will actually define what kind of market outcomes we get. And markets, so they're built, they're designed, they're outcomes, which is, by the way, a great point. It should make us less depressed when we see what's happening out there, because it means we can actually change things. We can rethink how to design them in better ways. And so what I did in this book, and sorry, this is completely self-promotional, but it's kind of nice when your book is translated in lots of interesting languages, especially when in German they call it Das Kapital, because I don't think it's going to happen again, but Das Kapital des Staat, the capital of the state. It was actually interesting. I asked the German publisher, I was like, but that's not like a literal translation of the entrepreneurial state. They said, yeah, but the progressives in Germany just don't really like the word entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial. And I kind of thought about that, because in Italian as well, that word doesn't mean what it actually means in English, which is welcoming of risk and uncertainty. It kind of makes you just think of some businesses which we call commercialisti, who just kind of try to avoid tax. But it was interesting. It was interesting. But I love the word Das Kapital des Staat, not only because it makes one think that maybe the book will have huge revolutionary impact, as Das Kapital did, but actually it's very clear. It's about the capital of the state. It starts making you think, oh, like a portfolio, investing, not just lender of last resort, investor of first resort. And then difficult questions, well, what does that mean? What's the risk profile? What do we even mean by risk in the public sector versus risk in the private sector? And how might you distribute that risk along different types of, say, renewable technologies if you want a green transition? It may be going beyond the renewable energy sector and have a real green direction for the entire economy. Anyway, I started to really like that. But every other country decided not to go down that route. And anyway, and also if you read Carlo Polanyi, someone who really influenced me he basically studied everything. He was a historian, anthropologist, sociologist. He reminds us in his great book, The Great Transformation, that in fact markets, how we use the word market, which is basically the capitalist national market, as opposed to international markets and local markets where you buy fruit and vegetables on the corner. Those international and local markets have actually been around for a long, long time, thousands of years. But the national capitalist market, which kind of gives us a sense of an average price of a kilo of oranges, was actually forced into existence from different types of policy making acts, which means that we should be careful when we even use the word, forget which side of the political spectrum, but kind of policy as an intervention in the market is just historically wrong. The market itself, as I mentioned, is an outcome of all these different actors. So you're not intervening in the market, you're actually co-shaping and co-creating that market for the good or for the bad, whatever. But this idea that the market's just out there and you're intervening in it. Similarly, by the way, businesses, when you do criticize them, as I sometimes do, speaking to different business leaders who I often find myself talking to, and I say, why do you do all these share buybacks? Why not reinvest? And they say, yeah, you're right, But hey, this short-termism is kind of being forced on us by the market pressure. And I'm like, but hold on, that, how you are behaving is actually determining the market. So this feedback loop and this tautological way that we think about markets. So it's really important to kind of unpick these words instead of just repeating them. So again, what I tried to do in the entrepreneurial state is precisely unpick the kind of fallacy, one could say fake news, that we have in terms of where all this wealth came from. And again, that the Labour Party itself somehow was using the word wealth creator to mean entrepreneurs in places like Silicon Valley. And I won't go through that because it would take me a long time, but what I tried to do was really to use kind of history, especially in the US, but not only, to kind of show that many of these products that we think kind of came out of entrepreneurship, along with business states just doing basic things like infrastructure and some basic science here and there, actually would never have happened without the state taking massive risks through particular types of organizations. So this isn't just public money, which acted as, again, an investor first resort. In fact, in this case, in all the technology in your smart products, whether you have an iPad, an iPhone of any make, that make those products smart and not stupid. People don't say, oh, sorry, let me talk to my idiotic phone. They talk about it as a smartphone. And everything that makes that phone smart was an outcome of a public investment that could have also gone wrong. So the internet, for every internet, there's also been many failures, and that was an investment made by a particular organization inside the public sector, DARPA. But the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, and I could go on and on. Fracking itself came out of initially DOE investments in the US. And that, by the way, is a good reminder. This isn't a normative point, oh, the state did all this good stuff. No, but the state is transformational in that kind of Polanyi-esque kind of sense. So we should be having debates in society about, well, what is the state investing in? And there's this, again, feedback loop that because we dismiss the role of the state in its transformational power, its investment power, we sometimes also don't look at what's being invested in until maybe it's too late. So lots of debates that do exist about fracking and shale gas only happened after the fact. And few people also know that that came out of public investments. But you know, in terms of this green transition, which so many countries are asking for, and one thing, by the way, I've learned over the last 2 days, it's amazing how much you can learn when you visit a country and CPD organizes your schedule and makes sure you have literally no time to do anything else but talk to all these interesting people, which has been fantastic, is learning just how much actually your population is demanding this green transition, that in some ways it's the policymakers that aren't, you know, if you want, acting up towards that challenge, but the people apparently, from what I understand, are kind of demanding some concrete action, and this should be very encouraging news. But around the world, what we see is that the investments themselves, in terms of the renewable energy side of the green transition, and we shouldn't forget that it's not just about renewable energy, it's about greening the entire manufacturing sector, getting green services, having demand pull and supply push kind of investments. But just looking at renewable energy, what we see is a very similar pattern that we saw in biotech, in nanotech, the internet, that upper right-hand quadrant, high risk, high uncertainty, high capital intensity, is in fact being occupied by different types of public actors that we just then don't really understand, because we, again, don't have the narrative and the discourse and the theory and the framework to understand it. So ironically, many public banks, for example, that are playing a leading role on the deployment and diffusion of renewable energy, like the KfW in Germany, the China Development Bank in China, the European Investment Bank, then ironically get sometimes told that they're crowding out business. They're being too active, too ambitious. You know, let the market decide the direction. You should just be providing counter-cyclical finance. And yet history shows us that actually no, business tends to only follow once the government actually plays this kind of lead investor role, creating both kind of certainty, which people like Nick Stern have long argued for, but also really leading in terms of these high-risk investments, which also are often long-term, patient, mission-oriented investments. In fact, the short-term investments create lots of trouble. Venture capital, which is needed, but if it's structured problematically and very exit-driven, as it currently is, venture capitalists often want to exit in 3 to 5 years through an IPO or a buyout, can create problems, especially in areas that require that long-termism. So in the biotech sector, we've ended up with lots of PLIPOs, productless IPOs, because of the rush that was created. So, finance isn't neutral. How do you actually structure finance in such a way that it really can nurture these processes, especially in science-based sectors? And people like Bill Gates have actually been quite forthcoming about this, unlike Peter Thiel, who sometimes, well, I don't know, if you listen to what he says says things like that the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley should secede off the coast because they are being impeded by the state, and they shouldn't even have to pay tax because they're so valuable, of course, until the tsunami comes and they'll call the Coast Guard. So, I always say, yeah, go to the coast, but then stay there when the waves come. Or even worse, when they say, oh, if you increase that tax or impose that regulation, we're going to leave the country. I'm like, okay, I'll drive you to the airport. Just tell me where do you want to go. Because in fact, the really interesting and ambitious businesses don't talk like that, and they know. Again, Bill Gates is very clear that both he and Steve Jobs surfed a massive wave of government investments, and he rightly is concerned that that wave today is not being created, so we just end up with a bunch of surfers, which literally in California they have. I think you do too, though. I saw that in the Bondi Beach. You have a lot of surfers. And what's interesting, I love this letter. It was actually much longer than this that Keynes wrote to Roosevelt, because he's kind of saying the same thing, but in a a different way. And I think that modern Keynesians didn't really capture this. So they kind of bought into this idea that all you need is government in terms of being counter-cyclical, which is an important role. But this is more than that. He's saying, we got a problem here. You know, in business, it's not true that we have all these kind of lions and wolves and tigers and this kind of willingness to roar. That's why I have the lion and the pussycat in the front cover of the first version of the Entrepreneurial State. We've got a bunch of hamsters and gerbils and pussycats and, you know, domesticated animals. And he didn't mean it like a criticism. It wasn't like, gerbil. I think what he meant, and unfortunately this hasn't really been developed in much of his writings, was, well, we better understand better how to get the pussycat to roar, how to get these domestic animals to even want to invest. Right? This assumption that business wants to invest, and you just have to get rid of the impediments, get rid of the tax, get rid of the regulation, and then they're going to invest, is simply not true. It often has been ambitious and bold, directional, strategic, what I will soon call mission-oriented investments that got business to even see the opportunity for investment in the first place. And then a well-devised tax credit or something might affect the marginal contribution. But many countries, including, I would almost say especially, but that would be too exaggerated, Australia, over-rely on these indirect tax incentives. And it would only work if your business is already like super wanting to roar and you just have to kind of, you know, play around with the tax structure, whether it's an R&D tax credit or whatever, to make them invest more. But the evidence shows that there's very little additionality, that's what the word that economists use, with tax incentives. They don't make investment happen that wouldn't have happened anyway. What actually drives business investment is the expectations within the business sector in different parts of the private sector of where these future opportunities lie. And in fact, Warren Buffett, I usually have his quote up here, I forgot to add it because I already had too many slides. He often says, can you just stop reducing my tax? I don't even look at it. I invest when I see an opportunity, which doesn't mean that tax should go sort of out of the roof, but just to really understand, well, what is it then that drives these expectations in the business community of where these future opportunities lie? And that's exactly those kinds of public investments that I looked at in the entrepreneurial state, which came, and again, all these different sectors, which really laid down the groundwork, the high-risk, early stage investments, especially the capital-intensive ones, which then business was able to surf on. And this, again, just shows you that distribution of direct and indirect. So the indirect is the light blue. These are tax incentives that different countries might use to support business in their R&D decisions. And it tends to be that those countries that over-rely on the tax incentive and don't have enough of the direct kind of investment from the kind of DARPA-type institutions, but also strategic public banks or public venture capital funds like YOSMA in Israel, then don't actually get up, you know, galvanize and catalyze the business community to invest. And so there's a strong relationship, or I shouldn't say completely correlated, but anyway, there's a strong correlation between countries that have high business spending on R&D, that's what BIRD stands for, relative to GDP, and those that actually also have a good distribution of both direct investments and then just kind of rely on the indirects just for a kind of icing on the cake, not the cake itself. And in Australia, it's quite actually worrying that both the over-reliance on indirects has also kind of is showing up, in fact, in terms of a falling BIRD ratio in terms of business spending. And this is, again, something that just really needs to be thought about in terms of, well, then what should happen in order to also in terms of having a transition from an economy that has over-relied on natural resources and mining to one that actually, again, society is asking for a transition towards a green direction. What kind of policy toolkit? And this is why I then wrote this second book, The Value of Everything, because what I found was in my kind of travels around the world speaking to policymakers who were quite thirsty for this new narrative and framework about market co-shaping, market co-creating, is that even those that kind of agreed with it, like, oh yeah, wow, that's really interesting, you know, that Silicon Valley wasn't just entrepreneurs. I guess that does mean that we need to, you know, have a whole set of different tools across the whole innovation chain, supply side, demand side, patient capital, basic research, applied research, institutions that really facilitate the feedback between science and industry, that then the actual instruments that they devised were often kind of problematic. And when you looked at why they came about, like the patent box, which you should be congratulated as a country for not having introduced it. I'll say what it is in just a minute. Were lobbied for by companies in the name of innovation, in the name of value creation, in the name of wealth creation. So I wrote this new book, which really just kind of unpicked that word value. Just quickly, the patent box is this tax reduction on profits earned through areas that have patents, right, intellectual property rights, which makes no sense because a patent is already a monopoly for 20 years. So there's no reason to reduce the tax on monopoly profits. And it's very interesting how the pharmaceutical industry really lobbied that through. And if you look at the way it did it, it was very much in terms of value and innovation. And so many countries, even those that have had these kind of direct public investments, kind of just bought into that due to this very strong discourse. Similarly, I mentioned before, I think, Warren Buffett, yes I did, the particular tax he was complaining about that was just getting too low. You need Warren Buffett to say, stop producing my tax, was the capital gains tax, which in the US dropped by 50% in 4 years in the 1970s. And he rightly says, all that led to was kind of, higher inequality, didn't actually increase investment. And that was lobbied for very specifically by the National Venture Capital Association that basically had just organized itself as an organization of VCs who then made it their kind of big lobbying effort and succeeded to get that tax down. So I was very taken, again, as I mentioned, by both how the Labour Party talks and just kind of this commonplace assumption that, the state doesn't create value, it can at best facilitate it. Where did these ideas come from? And it was very interesting that in the history of economic thought, this was kind of at the core of how economists kind of also debated between themselves. So the physiocrats in the 1700s thought that value came out of farm labor. They were very worried about all the value that they saw as being siphoned out of the system by the landlords, who they called the sterile class. The classical economists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx, had a different understanding. They thought that value was very much in industrial labor. So Adam Smith wrote this whole book called The Wealth of Nations, where he really unpicked what was happening with the division of labor inside the factories of the time, the effect on productivity, the effect on growth, and hence the wealth of nations. And he was very worried about, again, value being siphoned out in terms of rent, the power of the landlords also at the time, but not only. And he talked about his unearned income. And again, Marx also very much thought that way. But what then happened was, and I go through this very, very laboriously in the book, through these 400 years, is that then this huge revolution happened in neoclassical economics. That this attention in the previous economists to the objective conditions of production that determined their understanding of value, whether it was farm labor, industrial labor, but this focus also on technological change, the division of labor, productivity, all of a sudden became this more subjective focus on basically prices and supply and demand curves and preferences. So even wages were understood no longer in terms of the objective class struggle and labor's bargaining power, but in terms of preferences for leisure versus work. So lots of attention on the individual. Now I'm not going to go through all that because that's a whole long lecture to tell you about this book on value, but it relates back to this issue of the state and can the state deliver? Because if the state itself can't be understood, even in terms of productivity, then how is it going to be able to also guide its investments and think of itself as valuable? And what's interesting with government is, whereas someone like Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, was able to, with a straight face after 1 year of the crisis, say, Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world, because basically, I forgot to say, this focus on subjectivity and preferences is basically a theory of price, which determines our theory of value, versus what the previous economists did, which is they had a theory of value, which determined a theory of price. The government, even if it wanted to, can't do that, because the way we actually account for government activities in GDP is only through the costs of the activity. So we don't actually have a measure for the value of the education system, of the health system, which of course can be structured in all sorts of different ways, because in many countries, those things are free, so we only know how to calculate the costs, say the salaries of the teachers, that goes in. So in terms of output per labor, if you don't know how to value the output of what government does, you literally can't account for its productivity. But this also, again, as I mentioned before, has very much, this is actually wed into how we think about the policymaking process itself in terms of just fixing market failures. And public choice theory, which is a whole kind of strong apparatus that has been used to train civil servants around the world also has very clearly kind of delineated those spaces where the public sector is allowed to tread and those where it's not, because if it goes anywhere beyond that, it's going to be at risk of getting captured and corrupted, to the point that many civil servants have actually been trained to think that government failure is even worse than market failure. So yes, correct those things, but just occupy as little space as possible. I see this, by the way, all the time with every year or every couple of years when the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, gets evaluated by the Treasury. It's told it's crowding out, right? It's fine to do documentaries about giraffes in Africa. It's fine to do high-quality news, but you can't do soap operas and talk shows. That's for business. So this idea that there's only, I'm Italian, so I think of pizzas. There's a slice of the pizza, a slice of the market that is okay for the business sector to operate in, another slice that's okay for the government sector, kind of shows that we don't actually have a concept of public value, so that independent of the format, how you're actually creating value matters, and the processes in place, which instead are very pertinent and very important and highlighted all the time for the business sector, which of course we know does create value. And so that's why you have CEOs and managers all over the world attending top business schools and taking these really cool courses like strategic management, organizational behavior, decision sciences, and they're told to take risks. And Steve Jobs had this great lecture to the Stanford graduating class. He said, be hungry, be foolish if you want to innovate. Have you ever heard a civil servant being told, be hungry, be foolish, be nutty, make mistakes, and then get up and learn again, like Zuckerberg proudly said, until more recently where he's been under more attack. But anyway, this is just common parlance, right? Venture capitalists are actually proud to say how many times they failed, because then they say, and then I succeeded. And instead, again, all these words that I began with are just so boring, and they, of course, fear failure. If you fail in the public sector, bang, you're on the front page of the news, and you are told, why were you trying to do anything more than these horizontal conditions? Recently in the US, this came up in terms of the Solyndra investment, this investment in a solar company that Obama, through the Department of Energy, gave $500 million in terms of a guaranteed loan, and it failed. And everyone's like, again, like the Concorde, stop. Government's stupid. You shouldn't invest. Just do the bridges and the roads and the skills, and then get the hell out of the way. And then we got a problem, right? If you want to get the hell out of the way, throw your iPhone away, because it would not be a smartphone, because those were strategic choices in all those different technologies. But also the same amount of money went to Tesla. Tesla got the same amount of money, just a bit less than Solyndra. Huge success up until he started tweeting. I've actually started doing some problematic tweets, so I shouldn't. Anyway, Twitter can completely bring people down. But anyway, Elon Musk, before he tweeted and smoked a bit, was seen as a success, right? But the normal person in the US doesn't realize that not only did one of his main companies, Tesla, get the same amount of money as Solyndra, but he also himself, for his 3 companies, including SpaceX and SolarCity, got $5 billion from the US government, right? So again, if the government actually understands itself as das Kapital des Staat, the portfolio of the state, it should also really be able to talk about that much better, so people also understand that this is hard. To have a green transition, you will be needing to provide that patient long-term capital, especially in the early stage for different companies, not just the basic research, but for the few companies willing to innovate to get us these transitions. And yes, that might sometimes end in failure. But the next question should be, well, how do you also make sure that you're not just subsidizing and bailing out the failures, but perhaps getting some of the upside from the successes? And it was quite interesting that Obama, in the Tesla example, said the exact opposite of what he should have. He said, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company. And Elon was probably like, yeah, okay. What he should have said, if you're successful, we get 3 million shares in your company. And in fact, the price per share went from 9 to 90 in that period, which would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss if multiplied by 3 million and the next round. Anyway, we don't think like that. And this is why also Obama here, looking very sad, looking outside of the window, was very right when he said, we actually live and do business in the information age, the knowledge economy, but the last major reorganization of the government happened in the age of black and white TV. And he's absolutely right, but this isn't a coincidence. We have this incredibly ideological apparatus, even in civilized countries like Australia, where you don't have something like the Tea Party. so many countries are just so wed to this understanding of this kind of limited role of what the public sector is for. And so we also don't have a rigorous way to talk about value as being collectively created, even though some illuminated business people like Buffett and Bill Gates will actually, sit down and say, well, actually, we would not have made the money we did without this amazing structure behind this. And that's why then, again, for me, it was very important to unpick this notion of value and to suggest that basically it'll be impossible to actually address these big changes that we have ahead unless we also see it as collectively creating the value. And literally, this should start changing the way we talk. All those words that I said were really lame and bureaucratic, and boring. And this is just some postcards that I send out to friends and family from the institute that I direct, just trying to get people to talk differently. And this institute that I, again, set up at UCL, which is a proper department, one of the main things we're trying to do is actually set up a whole new training program for global public servants to really be trained outside of this public choice, new public management box, which is very much part of the problem, and to unpick this word public value. What is it? What is it? How could it be that the BBC has had this discussion about public value for so many years, and yet economists, we don't even have that word in our toolbox. It is in business schools, but business schools, as we know, do a lot of fluffy, flaky things with little academic rigor. Just kidding. How many? Okay. Actually, I'm not kidding. But anyway, we can talk about that later. So I've gone over time. I just want to give you just a bit of an inkling of what I've been doing in some recent years, or the last 12 months actually, with the European Commission, which was really to say, how can we operationalize this idea about collective value creation? And for me, it was about kind of asking a really practical question, but it's actually quite philosophical, which is, how do we get to the moon? I mean, how can it be that we can't kind of, get our hospitals working properly, and yet we got up there? That's pretty hard. Sometimes I'm in the middle of traffic in London. I'm like, how can it be we got to the moon and we can't structure London traffic, right? So what got us to the moon, and again, I have completely run out of time, so this is going to be super quick. You'll have to invite me back just to do a talk on missions. But I did give a long talk last night on missions, and they told me to diversify tonight, so it's partly their fault. There was a very inspirational goal. It was addressing a challenge. The challenge was not going to the moon. The challenge was the space race and beating the Russians and the whole Sputnik thing. But getting to the moon and back again in a generation was concrete. It was targeted. You can actually answer yes or no. Did you get there? Forget that there's some weirdos that actually think we never got there. And there's a relationship with who, well, I won't talk about Brexit, but anyway. No, it's interesting, actually, the whole, skeptics of experts, what they think. And lots of different sectors across the economy had to invest. You could not get to the moon in jeans and a T-shirt eating a hot dog, right? There was specific types of clothing and textiles had to innovate. Specific types of food had to innovate. Of course, it was also a big aeronautics experiment. Then lots of different projects, of which most failed. We know the successful ones, because again, a lot of those projects ended up in our smart products. But what would it look like if we did the same thing around missions to address climate change? The different types of sectors that would need to invest, and using the full gamut of government instruments, from procurement to prize schemes to grants, not just to, as an old colleague of mine said, well, it's a technical word, pissing in the wind. But, and I know it sounds rough, but he's a very famous innovation economist who passed away, Keith Pavitt. What he meant was just kind of spreading out support to the SMEs or particular sectors, but actually rewarding those organizations that are willing to engage with government with these difficult missions. So using procurement and prize schemes to really welcome, bottom up, those organizations willing to invest. And instead of just talking about clean oceans, which of course was a huge issue, and if you watch Blue Planet, David Attenborough's wonderful series, the last episode, all this plastic in the oceans, what would it look like also internationally to really go after that problem and make, using again the full gamut of government instruments, but also rewarding those companies that are willing to co-invest in that project, and using again, across lots of different sectors, as opposed to seeing it just as in terms of getting plastic out. It would require lots of different innovations and investments in terms of what goes in the first place. And what this report that I wrote did, which has now actually become part of the legal framework for the European Commission, was also to kind of unpick what does it mean to pick a mission, and to be sure that it's bold and inspirational, and perhaps really try to get lots of different parts of civil society engaged in defining that mission in the first place, which is a bit different from the moonshot, because because that was very top-down by Kennedy and his team. In Germany today, the Energiewende mission has very much come out of also the green movement, fighting for that. And again, in Australia, amazing that citizens are so concerned with it. How can we actually devise democratic and stakeholder engagement to define these missions in the first place, but to make sure that they will also be designed in such a way that requires that cross-sectoral, cross-actor, cross-disciplinary investment. And just to say that, the missions in the past required particular types of organizational capacity and this kind of outsourcing of knowledge and capabilities within these state structures, which, as I said, was a feedback, kind of self-fulfilling prophecy from this public choice, new public management view of the world. In fact, how to design the organizations themselves to be mission-oriented. And it's quite striking if you just look at their websites of many of these that have been very impactful. They never describe themselves as just fixing markets. But if we don't understand what it means to have a mission and to see and test whether that variable, if you want, is important on our economic models, it doesn't in fact exist. We don't capture missions in how we think about the economy. I don't really have time to talk about this, but just to say that, this can also really frame how you do your industrial strategy instead of handing out money, focusing on challenges. We have a commission at UCL that I co-chair with David Willits, which kind of breaks down these challenges around clean growth, future mobility, and kind of what we've been doing in terms of this big commission we have and also engagement with stakeholders is what would it look like to really address the future of mobility with a concrete mission that would, include having a public infrastructure, public transport system, which was 100% accessible by people with disabilities. That would be one of the sort of bottom-up projects. So let me just skip ahead. What's the answer to the question, can the state deliver? Yes, it can, but only if we really change the way we think, the way we talk about the state, the way we train our public servants, and also the way that we also get proper deals. This is not just about de-risking, it's sharing risks and rewards. And that Tesla example of how things kind of got a bit strange of thinking that you would only bail it out if things went wrong. How can we really rethink the contract? So co-creating value, not just enabling it, market co-shaping, not just fixing, investor first resort, not just lender of last resort, but also really creating interesting spaces where these debates can be had, where we can contest value, where we can actually, talk about why is it that it's so easy for, again, Goldman Sachs to talk about itself as a value creator, just so difficult for a teacher or a nurse to feel the confidence and the happiness of this amazing value that, of course, they create, but we have no clue how to capture that and hence have a difficulty in nurturing it as well. And I am done, and I am 5 minutes over time, but I'm sure that's okay.
Thank you, Mariana. That was terrific. That extra 5 minutes was certainly worth it. I'll let Sam Mostyn thank you after the conversation. Suffice to say, though, that we've heard a sort of a tour de force about the role of the state and other actors as well in delivering public value. And of course, one of the things that makes this phone smart emerged from Australia's very own scientific research organisation, the CSIRO, in Wi-Fi. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very difficult to be in two places at once, but Laura Tingle is managing that brilliantly tonight by both being on the 7:30 report and speaking with all of you tonight. You can catch her on the program on iView later on, but for now, would you please welcome Laura Tingle and Professor Glyn Davis to have a conversation with Mariana.
Thanks, Trav. And I don't know about you, but my head is spinning after all of that. Bravo, Mariana. As a way of organising the conversation, there are two particular things that you're talking about. One of them is about ideas and how you change the framework in which we think about them. And the other one is the institutions you need to do that. And I suppose I'd like to start with the idea about how you rethink the contract and that idea of missions, because that seems to me a really clever way of, because we can all talk about all of these things. But is that realistically the only way you can sort of start to sort of force the institutional change, that you say to somebody, okay, we're going to go for a specific goal and we're going to organise around that? And is that because the sort of institutional forces, the intellectual arguments are so deeply entrenched in the way we think about the public sector and its role in those economic terms, that's the only way we can do it? We can't challenge it more broadly just because the forces are so entrenched?
So I think there's different aspects of that. So you're absolutely right. Of course, it's not just about setting big goals, but it's so incredible what you can do when you have a problem to be tackled, instead of obsessing about, sector or technology. And so I think one of the things that's powerful about the concept is it also allows us to transform our current institutions, which are often problematic. The reason industrial strategy hasn't worked often is because it really just ended up being handouts to sectors and firms that were just louder asking for money. Academics, by the way, we're very good also at asking for money, so we also can capture government policy. So actually, the work we did in Scotland, for example, was to work with Nicola Sturgeon about transforming their public bank so that what it was about was lending out this patient strategic long-term finance to, again, any organization in the Scottish society, if you want, that was willing to engage with their inclusive growth strategy, their innovation-led kind of, a green strategy, which just means that you are no longer just about, again, handouts and asking, business what it needs, but setting sort of strong public goals. And that's the second point, which is even in countries where there has been kind of a mission-oriented organization in a particular area, say in health, the National Institutes of Health in the US, which spend over $30 billion a year on financing that kind of high-risk part of the pharmaceutical industry's research, they've themselves become captured, this is a public actor, because they have allowed the pharmaceutical industry to define this kind of market of health. So there's too much investment, I would argue, in research on drugs, medicines, too little on some other things which don't even sound that exciting, like diagnostics and surgical treatments, but much less on healthy living. And the real role, I think, of an ambitious public actor should be to be sort of a thorn in the side and to be stretching the boundary of even how we define that market. That's what I mean by market shaping and market co-creating. It's a redefinition of the market itself. But the last thing I want to say is the point about missions is people are quite depressed, right? I mean, I'm sure a lot of you, well, you all look a bit depressed because you're in the dark there. But I often find myself, I often say, I go to speak to, countries and especially public servants worldwide, and I walk in as an economist and I walk out as a life coach because so much of this language actually just makes you feel like that, right? So as soon as you start saying, hey, there's some big problems to solve, and what do you think those problems are? How can you also engage with the actors in your society to really define those problems and then go after them as an investor, as a co-creator? It kind of makes you feel good again. So in an era of populism and also of real disengagement and lack of public trust in these institutions, missions, if they're also, again, co-defined in that kind of way that I mentioned in the German society. It's been interesting how the green movement was central, can actually kind of make us all feel not just good, but also tackle these challenges together. But it's not easy. It's not just about, setting a mission. It's about using it as a way to unpick the problematic current structures we have.
Right. Well, I want to ask you about some of those countries in a moment, but Glenn, I'd forgotten about you and the 2020 summit. I suppose listening to Mariana, one of the things that's interesting to me is that we have sort of had a bit of a run of that in the Great Rudd era, and my argument would be when Kevin Rudd was running for government in 2007, he was saying, let's build the NBN, let's put a computer in every classroom. Now, this was basically blasphemy. This was talking about big public sector investment. Then he got in, the GFC hit. Australia had a very different role to everybody else in terms of, putting all that upfront investment, for which it was castigated and criticised. But I suppose, based on what Mariana's talking about, I'm interested in your reflections on why that didn't work in an institutional sense. Was it because of what Mariana talks about, that the public sector wasn't up to it, or was it because the forces rained against that change of thinking were too great, including, I would say, the media?
Yeah, indeed. Can I just start by echoing, I thought it was a fabulous lecture. Thank you. It's just wonderful to hear you. And a wonderful book. The value of everything is any economist who can start by picking up an Oscar Wilde quote and using it is doing really well, and it just gets better from there. And to sustain chapters about the definition of value under Adam Smith, under David Ricardo, and under Karl Marx. This is a formidable intellectual achievement. So well done. It's just a great read. I think there are 4 things, and I'm sorry to be boring and have a list, one social, one economic, one technology, and one existential, that explain why we didn't go anywhere. The social one is actually the long-term decline of social capital, which has been long discussed. In the Australian context, that's meant the atrophication of political parties, so that what's left are the apparatchiks and the hacks and the people for whom this is a career. And that ability to then knock off leaders and the instability that's brought on is because there's no ballast in the process anymore. And so we've actually suffered, I think, a real price from that. The economic one is described very well in the book. It's the forces that got us to the marketisation of everything and then the global financial crisis that arose. Mariana's book has an exquisite explanation about how finance became central to our economy and how it moved from unproductive to productive in all sorts of ways. And that has been really important, but it left us highly vulnerable in lots of ways. The third is the technology one, and that is all of our platforms for public conversation largely vanished, almost overnight. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but we didn't replace them. We don't have other things. All we've got is this giant comments page called Twitter. And so we don't have that discussion anymore. So you can't address the first 2 because there's no forum to do it. And the fourth, Mariana's also touched on, is the existential crisis. Climate change doesn't lend itself to politics as usual. It's managed in the last decade to rip aside both of the leading political parties in this country, which is quite extraordinary, and done it more than once. And we still can't arrive at a policy that makes sense for the nature of the crisis and the existential notion. A democracy that faces a crisis like that, and they don't come along often, is really tested in a way. We had those 4 things all come together all at once, and not surprisingly, we haven't done very well against any of them. I'm not surprised that a government elected on the eve of the GFC wasn't able to address them, but it was the same government that was then ripped apart by climate change, not by finance, only to see those that followed do exactly the same. This is a different moment for us, and it's not one that solves just by saying more democracy is better, and if we had more, in the same way that Brexit has shown some underlying issues in Britain that aren't going to be fixed just by going back to process.
So if we look back at some of the countries that you've looked at in the sort of climate change prism, I'll be controversial here, is China actually the most successful country in addressing climate change, partly because it is basically still a centrally run economy? I mean, lots of different countries are doing things about climate change, but if you think about the country that has had the most dramatic impact on green energy, I'd just ask you whether, I mean, it seems to me that in a way the impact it's had on the price of solar power, for example, globally has been incredibly significant. Could you just maybe address the way some countries and that sort of role of the public sector has worked to date in the last 10 years, say?
Sure. So China is spending 1.7 trillion in greening its economy. And that's not just about, well, that's renewable energy, so the solar example you gave, but also, energy-friendly technologies. It's doing also what Germany's doing in terms of getting its entire manufacturing base to lower its material content. This happened in steel in Germany, which was very interesting. But, huge amounts of money, but precisely because it's actually seen it as, with extreme urgency, almost that kind of wartime scenario because of this extreme pollution. It's extraordinary, the amount of pollution. And so that's also interesting how regardless of whether it's a democratic or not democratic society, when something happens that's really treated with urgency, like going to war, right? I mean, in democratic societies, when countries go to Afghanistan, Vietnam, or World War II, they don't say, oh, we don't have enough money. They just go. They find the money. And so what happens when you actually also frame some social or political or, these tricky or what they're called wicked problems like climate change, but also inequality with urgency. It's interesting to remember Johnson talked about the war on poverty or, the war on cancer. If then that's framed, I think, in this mission-oriented lens, which require lots of different types of actors in the economy to fight that together and also to use government instruments to reward not just any actor, but those that are willing to take on these kind of high-risk investments, then you do get these big changes. In Denmark, a tiny little country, it's small. Can't remember, but it's small. It has become the #1 provider of high-tech green services to China's green economy. And that's not just because, it devised some sort of, carbon tax or tax credit or something. They really have had a green vision in the country, often at the city level, by the way. Cities and states around the world are often, you see this in the US, where New York City and the state of California are reacting against Trump's denial of climate change. But, it's often been also missions around cities, a sustainable city. That then requires all sorts of services to make that happen, so that the startup community isn't just kind of doing gadgets, but also servicing a transition of a city like Copenhagen. So what was interesting in Denmark is they ended up having the mission, but they also had the manufacturing power with companies like Vestas, who also have benefited from the patient financial institutions in Denmark. Denmark, by the way, has also had something very important, which is an organization called Mind Lab inside the government, which really tried to help the civil servants to really kind of think out of the box and do that MBA-style, welcoming exploration or experimentation that I was talking about before, kind of facetiously. But, China's interesting because of that urgency. China's interesting because it's learned from Silicon Valley in an area where Trump is unlearning it. Trump is the first US president to really go after what I call the entrepreneurial state. The first thing he did in office was go after ARPA-E, which is the sister organization of DARPA, which came out with the internet, but in the Department of Energy. He wanted basically to abolish it. And, he's smart. People make fun of Trump, but he is smart because if you want to destroy the state, you don't go after its budget. Budgets come and go, as you see. Theresa May is spending, Trump is spending. You go after its institutional capacity. So, the neoliberal project in its best form is when you go after the organizations. It's interesting also that Romney went after PBS. And ARPA-E himself, which, this isn't about saying good guy, bad guy, but, also understanding how these organizations have been innovative and have been able to think out of the box is something that China, I think, has been studying sort of with a microscope. And someone once said to me, China's not necessarily yet the entrepreneurial state, but it's very much the adaptive state. It looks around and it tries to understand what works, what doesn't. Then, of course, there's the whole democratic issue, but that's not what we're talking about.
But I mean, the bottom line here is that people in China don't think the state's bad, I suppose. You were saying yesterday that, there's still a meritocracy in China, that people value the state, so it's not, they're not sort of having to sort of fight off the idea that whatever they're doing is bad in the first place. So, as you say, you've got, at the other end of the spectrum, you've got Trump destroying the institutions, but is a real reason for the success of China, whether it's in the green space or in the economy more broadly, just the fact that it actually thinks the state is a good thing?
Well, I think the future of China will be determined by all sorts of things, and it's not about sort of state, not state, it's how its state actually ends up evolving. So a decentralized network of different types of public actors has been very important in some countries to compete and to be, produce the kind of goods the world wants to buy. So currently they have large state institutions, including the China Development Bank, which has played a huge role in providing that patient long-term finance to its companies, both in the renewable energy sector, as well as companies like Huawei, which is in the news this week. By the way, Huawei, most people don't realize it's a cooperative. It's like John Lewis. And I was once in a Davos kind of setting with some of their leaders, and they said to me, how can we, think about not so much marketing, but kind of getting the U.S. public to understand who we are, because, they're just presented this was about 7 years ago, they presented Huawei as some, spying agency trying to get hold of the telecoms of the world. And I said, tell them you're a cooperative. It's just interesting that there's different ways to structure capitalist companies, and they don't have to be shareholder driven. They also don't have to be completely state owned. There is, different types of governance structures, and that stakeholder governance structure, not shareholder one, especially in the co-op area, has historically actually been, in places like Italy, very powerful. And wouldn't it be interesting, actually, if China could, along some other developing countries that are sort of going up in the chain, also re-experiment with different types of governance structures? But the whole meritocracy thing is interesting. I mean, we've seen what happens in much of the Western world when you have the kind of Eatonite pathway to government and the kind of idiocy that produces in people like Boris Johnson. So this is, sorry, had to put that in there. But yeah, meritocracy is a good thing.
Yep.
Can I just add to that? It's why Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk, is the most scary read of 2018, because he's talking about what happens when you run down the institutions of the state in a democracy, particularly when they're responsible for very long-term programs like looking after nuclear waste. You start cutting those agencies and the consequences are way beyond the political cycle. It's a really important read, I think.
Well, Glenn, you're also involved in the Thodey review, as Trav mentioned, and I don't want to obsess about the GFC, but I want to take up the point that Mariana makes about how when there's a war, we tend to galvanise our forces. And the thing that's sort of striking to me about what she says about the GFC is that suddenly we had this crisis, and it does usually, a really huge crisis usually does produce a reset in thinking, and it often produces a point of time where everybody looks to the government to fix things. Okay. And it sort of didn't really happen this time. I mean, and I don't just mean in Australia, but the fact that the US interventions ended up being so, so much of a schmozzle, as you say. I mean, why was it that there wasn't that reset in thinking? Why didn't we go, well, just the financialisation of the system has been a real disaster, the banking system's almost brought us undone, we need to change the regulatory framework. I mean, what do you think happened there?
Without putting words in Mariana's mouth, her argument in the book is very much focused on the definition of value that we operate from, which actually doesn't give us any flexibility to rethink policy because it ties value to a set of actors and outcomes and markets. And we didn't want to go there. I mean, the fundamental question about the banking system in 2009 was without the state intervention, we'd have got into deep depression and we'd have lost the banks. We didn't conclude, therefore, the banks should be in public ownership. We just concluded that we should look after them and then, with very little cost to them, in fact, very little indeed, allow them to go back to the way they were. And the point about our Royal Commission now is it's showing how little change we had. I'm agreeing with you in the 10 years. So Mariana's trying to argue that, or is arguing that the value, the way we define and understand value is the essential change we have to make in order to change the policy settings. That's an incredibly ambitious argument. Some of the reviews of the book, I'm thinking of Martin Wolf's review or Howard Davies, have sort of said, well, I like the analysis, but I can't see there's another way of thinking about value except price. And it's they call it a distinction without a difference. And if we can't separate these things, it doesn't have a policy path that comes off it, which is presumably the criticism that you've been listening to and responding to.
Because I suppose this is my point, though. If there was going to be a time when we did think, wait a minute, this is all wrong, shouldn't it have been at the GFC? If we were going to say, wait a minute, something has gone profoundly wrong here, we have to really rethink these things. I understand what you've said about all of these things, but I still don't quite understand why that didn't seem to happen. Why we didn't have more of a breakthrough moment then.
Right. So first, it's important to also quantify just how little has changed. So, one of the things that caused the crisis was this very high level of private debt, not public debt. It's amazing how much of the world then focused on reducing deficits in reaction to it, but it was the private debt that got completely out of control. And today, private debt to disposable income globally is back at record levels as it was just before the crisis. So in both the US and the UK, which were the kind of epicenters in terms of the banking system, which then fuels itself by this kind of high amount of public debt, it's very interesting. But then you have to ask yourself, private debt, why is there all this private debt? I mean, if real wages aren't increasing, as they haven't been increasing since the 1980s in many countries, many citizens actually had to take out debt just to retain their existing living standards. So in terms of why, what have been the bottlenecks and the impediments to actually get real wages to increase, there you'd have to look at bargaining power, again, of trade unions, as I mentioned before, which historically have, of course, been very important, but also this kind of lack of reinvestment back into production, which includes into the workforce itself. Skills don't just come from government training programs. They also come as endogenous effects of the investment cycle itself. So when we have this falling amount of government investment, workers obviously aren't benefiting. We haven't somehow gotten our acts together. Again, if we can get to the moon, why couldn't we get a financial transaction tax? That wasn't a very hard thing to do. It's incredible that there isn't a global financial transaction tax. And of course it has to be global, it can't be one country. And this whole issue of these financial institutions, when RBS and other types of banks became, publicly owned, why not really transform them and use them in this kind of, mission-oriented way to tackle publicly set goals instead of just kind of quickly restructuring them and selling them off again. And by the way, the huge amount, the trillions that were plugged into the system through quantitative easing just ended up back in the banks, right? Because it wasn't accompanied by also a creation of opportunities for that investment. And that's, part of the story is it's not just the bank's fault. If there aren't opportunities to invest in, then where did we think that money was going to go? And so there wasn't an ambitious fiscal policy. And in fact, in Europe, it was a real deformation of the word fiscal compact. It was basically just how much not to spend. This kind of voodoo number of 3%, you can't have well, now it's like zero, everyone wants a surplus, but this idea that you can't have over 3% of a deficit, otherwise all hell is going to break loose, was just a complete fallacy. Italy, my country, has had a low deficit for years. It's never had a high deficit. It's always had a lower deficit than Germany. But because the public and private sector were equally problematic and not investing and not long-termist and not also structuring themselves properly, debt to GDP rose and could in fact rise to infinite level if the denominator is not growing. So if you're not investing through the different sectors in terms of long-run productivity drivers, long-term growth drivers, then debt to GDP can get very high, even with a mild deficit. Just that basic distinction wasn't sort of rising in the media. I mean, I often go on Newsnight, and I often said to Evan Davis, come on, you keep repeating the stupid things. Do you think labor should just run on infinite deficit? I'm like, you're not listening. That's not the problem. We obsessed with that number. And that's interesting, actually, with the Brexit debate, where some people, even some smart people like Larry Elliott, him, the journalist in The Guardian, he actually supported Brexit because he said the European Union has just completely lost its way and it forced austerity, et cetera. And part of that argument is right. I mean, Europe really, I think, obsessed with the wrong numbers and caused all sorts of problems because the diagnosis of why the pigs, I'm allowed to say that because I'm Italian, so Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, if a German calls those countries pigs, you can't do that. It was a Goldman Sachs terrible term to refer to those countries. The diagnosis of why these countries were periphery and why the stronger countries were core was that the peripheral countries had sort of spent too much, which is like, no, they didn't. They had just spent really unwisely. They didn't have some of the institutional capacity that countries like Germany and the Scandinavian countries had. So public banks, Fraunhofer institutes, vocational programs that were serious, the, again, corporate governance structures of a certain type. So imagine the European Union as a learning ranking institution, kind of what works, what doesn't. And instead of shoving down the throat to Greece, spend less, just cut everything, say, hey, you can't be part of the union if you don't also have these really important research organizations that provide science industry linkages, if you don't have patient finance, if you don't really train up your workers through well-devised vocational and apprenticeship programs, and rethink your corporate governance structures. That would be a different type of European Union. But of course, by Brexiting, you're no longer part of the conversation. So that was a really kind of dumb thing to do. But it is true that Europe really should be taking this moment to rethink itself. And that does require also thinking about how value is created at the governance level. Because what we actually see in Europe today is a model that is actually going towards the American one.
Well, I just take you up on that. I mean, we mostly hear about Brexit and England here in terms of what's happening in Europe, or the whole deficit sort of focus. But it strikes me that the sort of concept of the state is much stronger still in Europe than it is in Anglo-Saxon countries, and the sort of absolute dominance of markets is not as great. I mean, you've talked about the fact that there is, in Germany, these schemes, it's come out of green politics. In Scandinavia, you get a lot more investment. I'm just interested in your perspective on if you can group them.
Yeah.
There still seems to be more of a culture of the role of the state in Europe.
So Europe is very heterogeneous. In some European countries, yes. In many, I would say the majority of European countries, no. And the whole point of my entrepreneurial state book, which was don't believe the hype, the US actually has a much stronger state than many European countries do. Americans talk Jefferson, but act Hamilton. And I'm not talking about the musical, even though you should see it. It's a fantastic musical if you can get tickets. But, Hamilton being the kind of the proponent of state intervention in the history of the United States. Actually, on the innovation side, on the competitiveness side, the state in the US has been extremely active, strong, interventionist, and visible hand, not invisible hand. On the welfare state side, it's been a disaster. I mean, I don't know if you've been to San Francisco lately, but it's a crime, the amount of homeless people and sick people in the street. And many US cities and states should be embarrassed by, the barbarism really that has been allowed by not having a proper welfare state. But unfortunately, many European countries are going that way. So that's my point. We should, if we're going to talk about Europe, really have a reflection, what works, what doesn't. And the problem is that when you also have a distrust in the European sort of Commission as this kind of higher level, and if you want state, precisely because some of the diagnosis has been wrong, so the remedies have just made the patient sicker, not better in terms of the weaker countries. There's also been this kind of distrust in the Commission itself at the national level. I mean, Germany. Anyway, I mean, it's interesting what's happened with Merkel recently, and also what happened when she was really defending also a progressive stance on immigration and the kind of backlash that she faced. But there is a way to reframe these problems. I mean, what's interesting on the innovation side, by the way, is that we think of it just as a technology thing, but imagine a public lab of the CERN type in Europe, but addressing immigration challenges. Why not? No, I'm serious.
No.
Immigration as a positive force. We know diverse opinions are important. We know that, you could also use the satellite system to make sure that no one dies on the Mediterranean. So there would be also that sort of technological issue of just making zero, that's a good mission, 0 deaths in the Mediterranean. We can do it. We have the technology, but I'm thinking more about the social structures and the thinking between anthropologists, sociologists, poets, the humanities, being just as involved in thinking about this big challenge that so many countries have around immigration. I know Australia has a huge issue in terms of some abuses, in Christmas Island, and let's throw our full capacity of knowledge in the 21st century at these problems, but in a way that really welcomes diverse thinking.
But don't we end up having these grand challenges always around technical issues because of the social divisions that make it difficult to have?
Yeah.
And there's our problem. How do we frame a grand challenge that goes to a direct social question like immigration and refugees, for example, that doesn't then play straight into the political divide here or in any country? And that's the problem Merkel encountered. She thought she had a national consensus and it evaporated the moment she acted. Even though most people, I think, outside would think she acted with enormous humanity.
Can you imagine the poets getting together with the bureaucrats in Australia?
I'm trying to.
We can't even sort of say, oh, we need to have a population policy without the politicians running a million miles.
Without having that argument.
Yeah.
And so that's why we end up focused on technical solutions and why we go for very conventional ways of thinking we can encourage the economy through stimulating R&D and the other parts of it, instead of having a broader conversation, as the book argues, for around what might you do to focus public investment in areas where you wanted to make a difference, which is precisely what we don't do.
Yeah.
One of the issues that's come up a lot in the current review of the APS, and I'm not speaking for that review, but given we're here in the name of John Menadue, one of Australia's great public sector leaders, is that, and Mariana picks on this in her book, the new public management of the 80s and 90s has seen us transfer enormous capability from public to private. We've contracted out an enormous amount. You've touched on this in your book on political amnesia. One of the CDP studies suggests, and I apologise, Travis, if I got the number wrong, that $1.7 billion of public money has been spent in the last 5 years on the big four accounting firms, basically transferring out money so that they would do tasks once done inside. One of the consequences of that is the huge loss of capability and capacity inside the public sector, because I'm sure KPMG do a fine job, but it doesn't stay in the state, and so you lose constantly that intellectual capital, and it's a consequence of changes that didn't set out to do that, but have had that. You discuss that in Political Amnesia. Mariana gives an intellectual history for back through economic thinking, back to public choice. But one of the questions we have to frame for ourselves is, are we comfortable with that if we are going to principally rely on outsourcing of public services and policy making? How are we going to capture the lessons and play them back into the policy process? Because that's the big risk. You will never get the integrated response to a major problem if you haven't got all of the players able to come around the table and have the conversation and discuss what's possible. And the more we fragment the state, the less we can do that.
Brexit, by the way, is being run by 4 consulting companies. No, I'm serious.
And so well, I
Do,
think. Yeah.
do you know Trafalgar Square has 4 plinths? Now there's a 4th plinth that can change. Some artist is chosen every now and then to do that 4 statue. I wanted to suggest that they do a clock. You know, like in Times Square, there's the deficit clock. You know, how much the U.S. government is spending. And I thought, let's have a clock on the Brexit spent, direct, not indirect. That would require modeling of the future job losses, which everyone would debate. But just how much we're spending on Brexit, and a big chunk of that is the day rates of PricewaterhouseCoopers. Yes, Martin. KPMG, Deloitte, et cetera, just because partly it's a huge challenge, forget whether it's right or wrong, and at the same time, the civil service actually has been decimated. The first thing that David Cameron said in the first month in office, 2010, was civil servants are the enemies of enterprise. And if I can quote Malcolm X, the chickens have come home to roost. You now got a problem. You got the biggest, management complex problem to manage, and they're not able to do it. And not because they're stupid, but they've literally, both in terms of numbers, in terms of salaries of the civil service, and in terms of the lack of capabilities, which has become, again, a natural consequence of thinking that you're not value creating. Why should you be investing in that? And outsource, and Jeremy Corbyn, by the way, has really failed not only to provide an opposition to Brexit, which, he's going to go down in the history books as not very well, alongside the ones who voted, who kind of actively engineered Brexit, but also he keeps reframing things in this old way of privatizing or nationalizing, which actually then dismisses this much more subtle point that you're making, which is it's not really just about whether the rail system is public or private, but how could it be that they allowed Richard Branson and others to come in and to get a piece of the pie with no conditions attached? So if you have a strong public sector, you could say, okay, this is the kind of rail transport system that we want. We want it to be modern, green, fast, et cetera. And so yes, come in, but that means you have to invest, you have to maintain it, you have to make it sustainable. And the lack of that is the problem, and that's due to this lack of confidence, but also literally at the contract level, there was no conditions attached. And similarly, these PFI schemes, the private financing initiatives in the health area were a complete disaster because they also allowed the private sector to come in and actually direct the show. It wasn't mission oriented. What was the actual mission? What kind of healthcare system did the state want to create? If that was really clearly delineated, then you could have some private providers for bits of it, but not to actually transform it in the process because they just made it a profit-making opportunity.
And you tell the story of the water authorities in the UK, the 5 water authorities, and the privatisation of those and the consequences now being felt. So it's a one-off fantastic hit for the budget on long-term cost, and that wasn't factored into the sale price.
Yeah, and the post office too.
Yeah. And even when you're not privatising things, you've got the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia, which is, a brand new institutional structure, and it's already being designed to work around large health organisations. They're already shaping it. And I just have to add, Britain's been poaching all of our trade negotiators because they didn't have any. So it's another sort of a source of institutional loss. We're almost out of time. I suppose once again, I'm just sort of interested, Glenn, just bringing this back home. I mean, how optimistic are you that we can actually rebuild some of that capacity in the public sector? I mean, you've not reflecting on what the review's going to say, but having listened to all of this, is it as simple as not outsourcing? I mean, because outsourcing...
that doesn't go... You can't go back. You can never recreate. We're never going to renationalise. We're never going to...
Maybe not contracting out or whatever.
But we're going to have to say, this hasn't worked. In a sense, we've taken the model as far as it can go. We now have whatever advantages it's delivered we've now got all the prices. So we're going to have to rethink. I don't think the answer is to say, therefore, you don't contract. I think the answer is to say, what is our sophistication in contracting, in specifying the price, in thinking the long-term value, and in sharing both risk and return between public and private. Which, I mean, I'm entirely sympathetic to the program that's in the book because that's essentially where it goes. It just requires a whole lot more policy work than we've put into it. It requires expertise we probably don't have. And it provides... So we need a way of encouraging our best and brightest young people to do what they did in John Menadue's generation. They went and worked for the Commonwealth. They cared about national government. They wanted to go to Canberra. They wanted to be part of this conversation. If all the work is done by consulting firms, it's really hard to persuade a new graduate that their future is in the public service and not in KPMG. Thinking about the consequences of our choices and how we can rebalance seems to me the answer.
But why should any young, bright person want to work in the civil service if the way these institutions are then structured is, again, so boringly, right? So I often give the example of Steve Chu, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who decided that he wanted to leave Stanford and go direct the Department of Energy in the US under Obama, not because he just thought it was interesting, but because Obama very explicitly said that the remit of the DOE around 2009 would be to help direct the stimulus program. It had a real mission. They wanted to, this was before the Tea Party sort of ended up bringing in the whole sequestration problem. But, it was an honor for him to direct an institution that was going to have such a bold remit. So the real question is, how can we rethink the remit? And this was the whole issue around the BBC, that they have sort of resisted the remit of just kind of fixing some public good problem with, some high quality, again, documentaries, but not actually being bold in terms of, the public value, even through the soap opera. So these kinds of discussions of how can you have not just the missions in terms of these, addressing the SDGs and climate change, but literally mission-oriented organization that sees its role in terms of transforming a landscape, not just facilitating it. Because if you're a really bright physicist, are you going to want to go work for an agency that wants to de-risk Elon Musk, or at best do a carbon tax? Or do you want to go work in an agency that's about really kind of investing in a serious green transition, which is going to, transform Australia? The latter obviously is going to attract really bright people, and they're going to want to go join the civil service. So how to really change these structures, and that's what we're trying to do in this institute. We're trying to both create a new curriculum, where we have 4 funky courses that hopefully will also make civil servants hungry and foolish, but also literally we've set up a platform for 30 different global organizations that we've identified as having tried, from ones in Singapore, Dubai, the US, and Brazil, have tried to step outside of this market failure fixing box to also share their experiences one with the other. And one of the key experiences is, how are you currently evaluated by your Treasury? You know, if you are evaluated based on cost benefit and net present value, it'll be extremely hard, no matter how much you'd like to have these kind of bold ambitions. So what needs to then replace what in the UK we call the Green Book, which is the way that the Treasury evaluates public investment? We actually need to see that through. What will be a different tool, literally the practical tools that could be available. And we'd love, by the way, for some Australian organizations to join this network. So I've been talking to CPD to help us identify. So the CEFC, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, is very interesting. We met with them today.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Please thank our panellists.
Thank you.
Well, what an evening. Travis welcomed us this evening by talking about the notion of a vision splendid for Australia, and CPD has done much in that regard to put that into a modern context, and reminded us, and as the CPD reminds us, Trav did tonight, that as Australians, more than anything, we expect our democracy to deliver that all people are treated fairly and equally, more so than any other part of our expectation of our democracy. And I think to have 700 people join us on a Tuesday night and to sit here and engage respectfully and fully to what we've just witnessed, both with Mariana and in the panel, says something about the desire we all have for great policy, for great debate, for great thinking. And as we pay tribute to John Menadue, and you've heard many times him referred to as one of the great policy thinkers, alongside some of the people who've also run CPD. So on behalf of our current chair and the board, I'd just like to say a few words of thanks for tonight on your behalf, and I guess respond to the fact that we had a wonderful speech and an oration, but then led us into a fascinating discussion which, if we could stay for longer, I'm sure would take us into remarkably interesting and fertile territory. Glyn, I remember you at the 2020 summit, and I think there are people here who also were at the 2020 summit. We all remember what those crazy days were like, but you were the voice of reason throughout that summit, that weekend in Canberra, and we heard it again tonight. You were able to take the essence of Mariana's provocation to us, unpack it, and then throw it back at us and say, but what do we do, and how we do that? Your respect for the public service and for public servants and the work you're doing on the review of the APS couldn't have come at a more important time. Thank you for joining us tonight and helping to reframe the challenge that Mariana set for us. Good luck with your next stage of life, but I hope we don't lose you to great public thinking and the kind of conversations you've brought to us tonight. Could you please thank Glyn Davis? So Laura, I just say thank goodness for you, because as Glyn already pointed out, when we lost that fundamental understanding of what our good media can do in unpacking things, you continue to do. I can't not watch The Insiders now because I want to hear what you have to say. I have to tune into 7:30 Report because you'll be there with another gem that you'll be sharing with us. I devour your quarterly essays, and I would encourage people to leave via the bookstall and buy all of Laura's quarterly essays, because they take us not just into Canberra but into the world you just opened up, right around the world, and most particularly your most recent take on leadership. And the way you wrote about leadership on behalf of all of us, I think, tells us why we invited Laura to be the facilitator for tonight. So for everything that Laura does and for tonight, can a big round of applause to thank her. And Mariana, I mean, honestly, it's very difficult to know where to start in thanking you tonight. I've gone back to the beginning of your book, the most recent book, where you quote Plato, and you talk about the fact that storytellers rule the world. Well, I think you're not only a rock star, but I think you rule the world. I think your storytelling is helping us to understand how we change the story. It was a masterclass in changing the language of value, of the public good, everything you took us through, it was a grand sweep through history and through the world we live in now. You say in the book, how we talk about things affects behaviour. That's been, people understand that, scientists understand that this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm hoping tonight that we start to talk a bit more like you, through your dizzying and exhilarating journey of how we do change the prevailing story of value. You've taken us to all the various actors engaged in that, but particularly the state, and your respect for governments and public servants is something I think those in the room who've chosen to come tonight really value, because we don't often hear about the value of good public servants and the role of the state and the way that you're able for us to see. Your enthusiasm for the possibility of change is infectious, and we need that kind of infection right now. You've reinvigorated the language of the public sector. You've reminded us how often we all fall into that terrible trap of describing other parts of our economy or our society that we're not part of with language that suits our own agenda. So we talk down the public service if we're not part of it, because it's easier to think that people are lazy and reworking things and not reimagining things. You've got ambition for the state, which I think is a breath of fresh air. You've got ambition for the state's outcomes. The setting of moonshot missions as a model is clearly something that can stir us in the issues that we face in this country, because we have so many of them. But you create an exciting sense of the future. That's why I think you're a rock star, because you've given us a chance to think about what we might be and what our moonshots might be. You referenced The Economist earlier. The Economist in only October this year did celebrate through a special edition what Australia can teach the world, and there were many nice things in that. There were certainly some reminders though of what we're not doing so well. But the article ends with a pointed remark that our ambitious reforms in this country have become rare, and that it was ambitious reforms that helped create a great nation. And Glyn spoke to that about what we used to have in the Commonwealth. But our public servants have done many important things, and I don't think we celebrate and talk about that enough. You mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not sure if people know, or that you know, that it was Australian foreign officials who helped to draft the very notion of the Sustainable Development Goals. They wrote the sections on peace and security. They worked with Timor-Leste to make sure that minor states were recognised, and Australian officials ensured that disability is captured in every single one of the 17 SDGs. They were Australian bureaucrats doing hard work, not being acknowledged, and they helped create something that you used as one of your framings for a better world. I would encourage you all to follow Mariana on Twitter. It's a really great Twitter feed to follow. I love the fact that one of her first tweets since arriving in Australia was showing our ocean pools along the eastern coast as an example of great public investment. So I love the fact that you actually make everything come back to the state and what we do as the public. And like many here, I am never going to misuse the term ecosystem again. I'm very guilty of that, so I'm going to stop that. But I think if there's one thing we can reflect on tonight before we drift off and buy your book and think more about what you've had to tell us, I just wanted to quote from some closing comments in the book. You say, if we cannot define what we mean by value, we cannot be sure to produce it, nor to share it fairly, nor to sustain economic growth. And there it is. We need to actually understand what value is. Thank you for tonight's tour de force, as Trav described it, and all your commitments while you've been in Australia. Your first time here, it's a very short but hectic visit. You may not know, Mariana is the parent of 4 children, including a set of twins. So it's a very active life back in Camden, including all of your academic work. I love the fact that you support Arsenal, because I love it when women like us support footy teams, and the red and the white is what joins us, because I support the Swannies. And you just get, like I do, the public value of football. So in trying to find you a present tonight, we thought we'd give you a little bit of Swannies to take home. So when you're going to the pool, you can wear your Sydney Swans cap, and you can wear your Sydney Swans jacket as you wander around Camden. Here we are. I suspect that's a bit Australian, giving away footy gear after such a remarkable presentation. but she's wearing it. It's fantastic. Thank you all for coming tonight. As I said, it's rare to have 700 people come out on an early weeknight and to be so attentive. It clearly shows why the work of CPD matters, why having Mariana matters, and why to have debates like this has never been more important. Thank you for coming to Carriageworks. As Trav says, it's my great honour to be chair of this incredible organisation. Do come back another day and see the remarkable Nick Cave exhibition properly. It is Nick Cave, the artist, not Nick Cave, the singer. So if you thought that Nick Cave had suddenly gone off into a whole new world of arts, he hasn't. But do come back and see what Nick has done right around the precinct, and do come back to Carriageworks again. Engage with CPD. We really thank you for coming tonight. The books are here, and I'd encourage you to have a look at that. And if you'd like to leave by that exit, it's probably going to be easier for you. Thank you, everybody. Please thank our guests tonight and enjoy your evening.